The sanctions were supposed to slow China's artificial intelligence industry. Instead, local governments across Western China started ordering more transformers, substations, and cooling infrastructure before many facilities even had confirmed chip deliveries. That should bother Washington. For 2 years, the public conversation around AI competition has revolved around semiconductors, NVIDIA's H100. Export restrictions announced by the U.S. Commerce Department in October 2022. Expanded controls in 2023 aimed at preventing advanced accelerators from reaching Chinese firms through third countries. The assumption underneath all of it sounded logical. Restrict high-end chips, restrict large-scale AI development. But AI stopped being purely a chip story the moment models became industrial scale. Training frontier systems requires enormous and continuous electrical supply. Inference, the part where millions of people actually use AI products daily, creates permanent energy demand that never disappears. A modern hyperscale AI cluster behaves less like a software startup and more like an aluminum smelter wearing branding. That changes the strategic equation. China appears to have understood this earlier than Western governments. While American officials debated semiconductor choke points, Chinese planners were treating electricity generation, grid expansion, and data center placement as parts of the same machine, different ministries, one objective. Look at the geography. Guizhou became attractive because hydropower lowered cooling and electricity costs. Inner Mongolia offered abundant coal generation, land availability, and expanding wind infrastructure. Ningxia and Gansu suddenly mattered because transmission capacity already existed nearby. Regions once considered economically peripheral started turning into computational backbones. None of this happened randomly. In early 2022, Beijing formally launched the East Data West Computing Initiative. On paper, it sounded dry and bureaucratic. Move compute-intensive workloads inland while keeping latency-sensitive services near eastern coastal cities. Fairly technical language, easy to ignore. The actual meaning was bigger. China was redesigning national industrial geography around computational power. That matters because AI data centers hate instability. They need constant electricity, predictable pricing, reliable cooling, and enough surrounding infrastructure to survive years of expansion. A training run interrupted halfway through can burn millions of dollars for absolutely nothing. You do not build that system casually. The United States still leads in crucial areas. American firms dominate advanced AI software ecosystems. NVIDIA remains the center of global AI hardware demand. OpenAI, Anthropic, Google DeepMind, and Meta still define much of the frontier model landscape. Even Chinese executives acknowledge that CUDA remains entrenched. But there is another layer beneath the software stack. And this is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable. America's AI boom is colliding with electrical constraints. Northern Virginia, the largest data center hub on Earth, is already straining utility infrastructure. Parts of Texas are warning about future load pressures from hyperscale facilities. Ireland temporarily slowed new data center approvals around Dublin because grid stress became politically impossible to ignore. The International Energy Agency estimates global data center electricity demand could more than double before the decade ends. China looked at the same numbers and reached a different conclusion. Build more power anyway. Renewables, yes. China installed extraordinary amounts of solar and wind capacity, but Beijing also continued approving coal plants at a pace many Western analysts considered contradictory. Chinese officials saw redundancy. Western observers saw hypocrisy. One side may understand industrial resilience more clearly than the other. And here is the deeper problem for Washington. Even if Chinese chips remain behind the frontier, abundant energy can compensate for technological inefficiency longer than many people expect. A less elegant system operating at massive scale can still become dominant. History is full of examples where volume defeated sophistication. We will come back to that. 3 years ago, a relatively obscure county in Ningxia signed agreements for transmission upgrades that looked wildly oversized for the local economy. Agricultural region, sparse population, limited manufacturing base. Yet planners kept expanding substation capacity anyway. At the time, some provincial officials privately described the projects as preparation for future digital industry loads. That phrase sounded harmless. It wasn't. Today, parts of Ningxia are being folded into China's national computing network because electricity there is cheaper and politically easier to scale than along the crowded eastern coast. That distinction matters more than another round of chip sanctions. Western discussions about AI infrastructure often assume data centers emerge where talent and venture capital already exist. Silicon Valley, Seattle, Northern Virginia, maybe Austin. China increasingly treats compute differently. Beijing views it as strategic heavy industry, closer to steel production than consumer software. Once you see that, a lot of decisions suddenly make sense. Steel mills go where energy is abundant. AI clusters are starting to follow the same logic. The East Data West Computing Framework essentially divides China into computational zones. Coastal provinces handle latency-sensitive consumer services because milliseconds matter for finance, e-commerce, and communications. Interior provinces absorb heavier training workloads where land and electricity costs are lower. Ultra-high voltage transmission lines tie the system together across enormous distances. Those transmission lines deserve more attention than they receive outside energy circles. China leads the world in ultra-high voltage grid deployment through State Grid Corporation and China Southern Power Grid. These systems move enormous quantities of electricity across thousands of kilometers with lower losses than conventional long-distance transmission. Beijing did not build this network for AI originally. It was designed partly to connect inland energy production with coastal industrial demand. AI simply arrived at the perfect moment to exploit infrastructure already under construction. America has no equivalent national strategy. The United States operates a fragmented electrical system split across competing utilities, state regulators, federal agencies, environmental review processes, and regional transmission organizations that frequently disagree with each other, sometimes for good reasons. Local accountability matters, property rights matter, environmental standards matter, but coordination speed matters too. A Goldman Sachs estimate released in 2024 projected that global power demand from data centers could rise dramatically before the decade ends, largely because of generative AI workloads. Utilities across the United States immediately started reassessing long-term planning assumptions. Some executives sounded genuinely surprised by projected consumption curves. Chinese planners did not seem surprised at all. That should raise an uncomfortable question. Did Beijing anticipate the energy intensity of large-scale AI earlier than Washington did? Or did China simply possess a political system capable of reacting faster once the trend became obvious? I suspect it is partly both. There is another misconception floating around Western policy circles. People assume China's coal expansion proves weakness in its renewable transition. In reality, Beijing may be prioritizing dispatchable stability during industrial transformation. AI data centers cannot rely entirely on intermittent generation without massive storage buffers or backup capacity. Coal plants, especially newer units integrated into broader grid systems, provide predictable baseload support while renewable capacity scales upward around them. Environmental cost? Absolutely. Strategic logic? Also yes. One Chinese energy researcher joked in a closed-door industry forum last year that coal had become the emergency generator for artificial intelligence. Dark humor, but revealing. Washington publishes reports warning about China's emissions trajectory. China responds by connecting another industrial zone to the grid. Different definitions of urgency. And buried underneath this entire story sits an economic reality ordinary people will eventually feel directly. Electricity is becoming a geopolitical weapon again. Not oil, not rare earths, continuous power itself. Because whichever country can deliver abundant energy to AI systems at lower sustained cost will eventually shape cloud pricing, industrial automation, military simulation capacity, pharmaceutical research speed, and maybe labor markets too. The AI race may look digital on the surface. Underneath, it smells faintly like burned metal and hot wiring. And there is one more layer Washington rarely discusses publicly. Several Chinese provinces are already pairing data centers with equipment manufacturers, creating ecosystems where power infrastructure, cooling systems, servers, and financing reinforce each other. That loop could matter far more than a benchmark victory over decades. There is a counter-argument here, and it deserves to be taken seriously. China still depends heavily on foreign technology at critical points in the semiconductor chain: Dutch lithography systems, Taiwanese fabrication dominance, American chip architecture, and software ecosystems. Even after Huawei's Mate 60 surprised analysts in 2023 with a domestically produced 7-nanometer class processor linked to SMIC, the broader gap at the cutting edge remains real. Chinese firms are not casually replacing TSMC tomorrow morning. A lot of people in Washington stop the analysis there. I think that is dangerous, because technological competition does not always reward the most advanced system. Sometimes it rewards the system that can scale hardest under pressure. Those are different things. Soviet aerospace struggled with precision manufacturing, yet still reached orbit first. American automobiles were often technically superior to early Japanese imports in certain categories, but production systems and cost structures shifted the balance anyway. History has a habit of humiliating people who confuse elegance with inevitability, and this is where the story reverses slightly. China's AI energy advantage may actually create new vulnerabilities inside China itself. Massive data center expansion consumes extraordinary quantities of water for cooling. Several inland provinces attractive for compute infrastructure already face long-term water stress. Coal-heavy electricity generation also deepens local pollution pressures at exactly the moment Beijing wants to stabilize public confidence in quality of life improvements. Then there is the financial risk. Provincial governments across China are carrying serious debt burdens after years of infrastructure-driven growth. Some AI projects may never generate returns matching their construction costs. Not every glowing server rack becomes profitable. American analysts pointing this out are not wrong, but they may still underestimate the larger direction of travel. Because Beijing does not appear to view AI infrastructure entirely through normal market logic. Chinese industrial policy historically tolerates periods of overcapacity if leaders believe the long-term strategic position justifies short-term inefficiency. Solar panels followed that pattern. Electric vehicles followed that pattern. High-speed rail certainly followed that pattern. AI infrastructure increasingly looks similar. Build aggressively first, rationalize later. Meanwhile, the United States is entering a strange contradiction. America possesses world-leading AI firms, while simultaneously struggling to build enough physical infrastructure around them. Utilities require years for transmission approvals. Nuclear expansion remains politically complicated. Natural gas projects face legal battles. Renewable deployments accelerate in some regions while grid integration lags behind. The software future is arriving faster than the electrical system underneath it. That gap keeps widening. Earlier, I mentioned that some Chinese provinces secured transformer and substation capacity before confirming chip deliveries. At first glance, that sounds backward. Why build electrical support before finalizing hardware procurement? Because Beijing may believe chips are a solvable bottleneck eventually, while energy shortages are harder to fix quickly once demand explodes. That is the key insight. Power infrastructure takes years, sometimes decades. AI demand curves move in months. Washington is trying to slow China by restricting access to advanced compute. China appears to be preparing for a future where compute itself becomes commoditized, but reliable electricity becomes scarce. If that future arrives, even partially, the strategic picture changes dramatically. And I'm not fully convinced American policymakers have emotionally accepted that possibility yet. One dry irony sits over this entire situation. Silicon Valley spent years talking about moving fast and breaking things. China's state planners are doing almost the opposite, building slowly, overbuilding constantly, reinforcing redundancies everywhere. Less glamorous, more concrete, literally. Sometimes boring systems win, especially when the competition depends on uninterrupted electricity. My prediction is this: within 5 years, energy availability will matter to AI leadership almost as much as semiconductor sophistication. Not equal, but close enough that countries with fragmented grids and unstable permitting systems start losing ground regardless of software talent. That does not mean China automatically wins. Far from it. The country still faces demographic decline, debt pressures, technological choke points, and growing international suspicion. But the assumption that export controls alone can contain Chinese AI development increasingly feels incomplete. Washington targeted the visible layer of the system first: the processors, the fabrication nodes, the supply chain routes. Meanwhile, China kept building the power plants, and maybe that was the deeper race all along. 47 engineers. That was roughly the staffing level reportedly overseeing one section of China's ultra-high voltage transmission expansion during an early construction phase in western China years ago. Not thousands, not an army of bureaucrats, a few dozen specialists coordinating power flow across distances large enough to cross entire countries. I keep thinking about that number because it captures the real story here. Modern geopolitical power increasingly belongs to nations capable of organizing complexity at industrial scale, not just inventing technology, sustaining it physically, feeding it electricity, cooling it, financing it, protecting it from interruption. AI may look virtual on your screen, but underneath the interface sits a very physical civilization problem: copper, concrete, turbines, transmission lines. China understands that instinctively. The United States understands pieces of it, but often through disconnected institutions pulling in different directions. One agency subsidizes semiconductor manufacturing, another delays transmission permits. Utilities forecast rising demand while local politics fights new infrastructure. Private firms chase quarterly incentives, while national strategy changes every election cycle. That fragmentation has strengths. It encourages innovation and competition. America remains extraordinarily good at producing breakthrough technologies precisely because the system is messy and decentralized. But infrastructure rewards continuity more than creativity, and AI is becoming infrastructure. This is where the military dimension enters quietly through the side door. Advanced AI systems are not only chatbots or image generators, they increasingly support logistics optimization, intelligence analysis, autonomous systems coordination, cyber operations, satellite data processing, and battlefield simulations. Pentagon planners know this. Chinese military planners absolutely know this. A country capable of sustaining larger computational loads at lower long-term energy cost gains advantages far beyond consumer software. Not instantly, gradually. The uncomfortable possibility for Washington is that China may be building an industrial ecosystem optimized for prolonged computational competition, while the United States still treats AI partly like a venture capital cycle. One side talks about infrastructure as national capability. The other still frames much of the discussion around startup valuation and market share. Those are not the same conversation. And here's the part I'm still uncertain about. I genuinely do not know whether China's model is economically sustainable over 20 years. There are serious reasons to doubt it. Provincial debt remains dangerous. Some projects will fail. Certain AI facilities may sit underutilized for years. Centralized planning creates blind spots just as markets do. Beijing can overbuild spectacularly when incentives become political rather than economic. But strategic competitions are often decided before inefficiencies fully arrive. That is the historical warning. The Soviet Union eventually collapsed under structural weaknesses. It still changed global power balances for decades before doing so. Imperial Britain became financially overstretched. It still controlled critical maritime systems long enough to shape an era. Long-term fragility does not prevent medium-term dominance. A lot can happen before the bill arrives. Earlier, I said electricity itself is becoming geopolitical leverage again. I think that trend accelerates from here. AI demand will pressure grids globally. Countries with abundant, reliable power will attract compute infrastructure. Countries without it will slowly become dependent on foreign cloud systems, foreign models, and foreign pricing structures. That dependency carries political consequences eventually. Imagine a future where industrial productivity, pharmaceutical research, military planning, and even public administration increasingly rely on external computational infrastructure because domestic grids cannot support scaling locally. That is not science fiction anymore. Parts of Europe are already confronting versions of this pressure around energy-intensive industries, and Beijing sees opportunity in that gap. One American official described China's strategy recently as building excess capacity everywhere simultaneously. The phrase was meant critically. I'm not sure it lands that way anymore. Excess capacity starts looking intelligent when every major technology suddenly requires impossible amounts of electricity, especially if demand keeps compounding. My prediction is straightforward. Within a decade, the AI race stops being described mainly as a semiconductor competition and starts being described as an energy competition with software attached to it. Countries that planned their grids early will gain leverage difficult to reverse later. China is positioning for that world aggressively. Washington still has time to respond. America retains immense advantages in talent, research depth, finance, and alliances. None of this is predetermined. But responding probably requires admitting something politically uncomfortable first. The market alone may not build critical infrastructure fast enough for the scale of computational demand coming. And that conversation gets ideological very quickly. Maybe that is why it keeps getting avoided. If you enjoyed this one, stick around. The next few years are going to produce some very strange alliances between AI companies, utilities, nuclear firms, and governments pretending they're not running industrial policy again. History has a sense of humor like that.